The ProAct Know-How.
Hi, it's ProAct Sam. Welcome to this webinar. We're a bit late, a bit like Brexit. We all thought today was going to be the start of the UK being outside the EU and the new world for EU expats living in the UK and the UK expats living in the EU. But all that's been postponed in quite an interesting way. What we saw on Monday was the UK Parliament rejecting the idea of having an election, having rejected the withdrawal treaty that the EU Commission and the UK government signed off. Now, that withdrawal treaty is an international treaty, so it's signed by the executive government of the UK and the executive government of the EU, the Commission, and ratified by the summit leaders. And if the UK Parliament had put that into law, then it would have become a valid international treaty which wouldn't have been able to be altered, because the EU and the UK and other countries around the world are bound by international treaties, which is all good news. But it's also the antithesis of what the scaremongers and the vested interests have been saying about Brexit, about the doom and the gloom. The world goes on outside the EU. The EU is a trade zone in itself, and there's got an element of free movement, but the international treaties still apply for travel, for work, for visas and for regulations. So what we thought we'd do today with the questions that we've had is look at what is an expat. And an expat transcends Brexit and is something that affects anybody who's living and working abroad. And the question we had this week was, what is an expat? Is a student studying in another country an expat? Well, they are in a way, but not in the generally understood way, because a student is going through a specific set of rules for their visa, a specific set of rules for their residency. In the UK, for example, during this Brexit period, where the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties have had this negative effect in the UK, students have lost the right to be able to stay in the UK and work for a year or two after they've completed their course. Whereas in many countries around the world, the expat could work overseas and in their country when they finish their course to earn extra revenue and also get some work experience afterwards. And obviously those students will be looking to remain and get a contract offer in which they could stay in their new country. That was removed by the UK under concerns about the level of migration that was going on. And the proposal of the current government is post-Brexit that period for students after they completed exams to stay another 2 years to live and work is coming forward. So there'll be a pathway for students in the UK to be living and working abroad. There's different types of expats. So generally when you talk about economic migrants, you're talking about people that are moving from a poor country to a richer country. Now that's all relevant. So a UK expat going to live and work in Dubai on a £15,000 a month contract could well be called an economic migrant, because that same person might only be able to earn 2, 3, 4,000 a month in the UK. So everything is relative, but obviously when you're coming from Africa, parts of the Asian subcontinent to work in Europe, a contract where you're on a minimum European wage of maybe 1,000, 1,500 a month is considerably higher than you could ever possibly hope to earn in your home country. So the world is full of migrant workers, people looking for higher salaries and better opportunities to support their family and workers living and working abroad. So migrant workers are expats, although they're working in a slightly different way. And part of Brexit was the impact. So the UK signed the Lisbon Treaty 2007. The UK was the only country that accepted EU citizens straight away to come and live and work in the UK. All the other EU countries put a 7-year moratorium on expats from other countries coming in to work in their country, which is what the rules allowed. Tony Blair's government decided not to do that, and that's why the first wave of EU migrants using EU citizen rights of free movement was heavily slanted towards the UK. Now, those people now have got the right to live and remain in the UK for the rest of their life under a permanent residency programme, and that's okay. And the rest of the EU now is a destination for those people, and so the EU is a different place with or without Brexit. But again, it's another form of economic migrants from the poorer parts of the EU to the richer parts. So you've got Germany and the UK, which are the 4th and 5th largest economies in the world, are obviously more prosperous locations for newly formed countries in South and East Europe, where better opportunities could exist. And therefore those people become migrants. But again, if you're on a low wage, your level of flexibility is slightly hemmed in, but you still have your legal rights. And part of the concern that we have with Brexit is protection of those rights for EU expats in the UK. And it is there. We'll come back to that later. So what is an expat in general is in terms of we talk about is somebody that's living and working abroad. They might just be living off investments, off business income or financial investment income or property rental income, but they're not living in their home country. But they might actually be taking a conscious effort to set up a business overseas or work in a different location. But there is always an element of transition in that. So one international treaty we have is on holiday travel. So if you think about holiday travel, in essence, around the world, everyone has the right to go to another country and visit it for up to 90 days. That could be for holiday, it can be to visit family and friends, or it could be to do business. So as long as you're sent as a travelling salesman or a travelling representative of your business in another country, you can travel on business to do work in that other country without becoming an expat, without becoming a resident, without paying tax in that other country. So and those laws are covered under an international treaty, but they're applied slightly different with every country around the world and within the EU. So although the EU might come up with common rules, each individual sovereign country within the EU has a different set of requirements that people have to be able to live and work from within the EU and with outside the EU. So the UK is fairly unique. It's a country where you don't require to register once you get into the UK. You need a visa to get into the UK, and once you're there, you don't need to register and have an ID card, whereas the European model is actually based upon everybody having ID within the EU to freely move within that area. But the interesting thing is that even so, if anybody, if we think about the EU, they've got 62 visa-free travel agreements for international holidays with countries around the world. The United States have got a similar, if not greater, number of visa-free travel arrangements. However, anybody that has got a free right to travel to the UK, to the USA, still has to have an electronic travel authorization. So it's not called a visa, but if you're traveling to the United States, you have to apply, tell them your name, your address, where you're staying in the United States, what your travel arrangements are in and out. So you're confirming your booking and your passport number. That all has to be authorized before you travel to the United States. Now, it's not called a visa, but it looks very much like an electronic visa. And everybody, even with a visa-free country, needs that to travel to the United States. And it might be that certain other countries you need to have a visa as well. And people talk about the green slip, which is the work permit, the work visa that you can get to at a later stage, a higher level of proof with the USA. Now the EU, despite it having free movement of people within the EU, is introducing its own electronic travel authorization system. It's already in place, but it won't become implemented until 2022. Where did that century go? So it's in force now, and within the next 2 or 3 years, anybody travelling to the EU from outside the EU will need this electronic travel authorization. Within the EU, the Schengen zone doesn't cover all EU countries, but essentially allows that free movement. But everybody in the EU has got an ID card, so they're already authorised to travel around the EU. So that is, that will exist. Now, with Brexit, if the UK leave the EU and they're not part of the EU free trade zone, they will need to become a visa-free country for EU travel to avoid that confrontation going forward. Now, the EU cannot agree that until after the UK have left the EU. Now, the transition period in the withdrawal treaty has not been extended. The Brexit date has been extended to the 31st of January, but the transition period hasn't been changed. And we don't know, but I've got no doubt that many of the basic standard arrangements have been agreed in principle between the UK and the EU that they can put in force very quickly after Brexit. But they can't confirm that because it would be against the EU law to agree any arrangement with a member that was about to leave. The UK have to leave first. Theresa May's plan with her withdrawal treaty, that was a simple first step before they got down to business. And the UK Parliament has got hung up with what the future arrangement will be when actually the EU can't discuss it until actually Brexit takes place, which is why we've ended up with this situation where the election is about staying in the EU or leaving the EU, and that'll be the question. So it's pretty much it will be decided going forward with a Brexit leaning government or without a Brexit leaning government. So with the UK, if they have left the EU by the end of October, by the end of October, that was a horror show, wasn't it? And on the 1st of November, they haven't left. If they leave by the 31st of January, there's still the transition period. Nothing changes during the transition period for EU expats in the UK or for UK expats in the EU. However, the deadline is still there. By the end of next year, family and business living, working abroad need to secure their residency, business, property, healthcare rights in their EU country or UK country of residence for their family and their business. So one of the things that the EU and the UK can agree very quickly is will the UK be a visa-free travel company, partner with the EU? I suspect that they will, because the UK has got more visa-free travel arrangements than any other country in the world. So it's not unlikely that individual arrangements will be made with individual countries in the EU if the EU don't make that agreement on the day after Brexit. So, but even if that UK becomes a visa-free country for travel after Brexit on the 31st of January, the new electronic travel authorization system will still come in place because the UK is outside that EU trade zone. And it'll be interesting to see whether the EU end up having the travel authorization for people within the EU as well. When you have refugees, when you have illicit migration, one of the ways of controlling your borders is making sure that everybody is electronically registering their travel and their movements cross borders. So we'll see how that pans out. That's the purpose with the USA, is to manage and track migration, economic migration, illegal migration, and people overstaying student visas or working visas. So those are the changes for expats coming up in terms of travel. So an expat is not a travel person, it's somebody that stays beyond that 3 months. So what's going to happen then for those people? So even within the EU, if a UK expat goes to live in any other country in the EU, or a EU expat goes to live in the UK now, they can still only stay for that 3 months before they have to become registered locally. So apart from the UK, so if a UK expat comes to Spain or to Cyprus or to Germany, then actually under their local ID regulations, they're supposed to be registered at the immigration after those 90 days. So you're free for that 90 days travel, but beyond that, you should register locally. That is technically what the law is. Now, they're not going to throw out an EU citizen per se, but that's what the ID rules and regulations require. And obviously, if you stay in a country for more than 6 months, then in a tax year, you're becoming a tax resident there as well. If you're starting an economic activity and you're working in that country, then again you've got an obligation to register for tax and the residency as well. So all those things come into play, even if you're an EU citizen, even if you're an EU expat. For those of you who've seen all my videos, some of you will know that I wear glasses sometimes, especially for reading, and I can see lots of people commenting and chatting away. Unfortunately, I can't read it at the moment, so my team are taking your messages and giving you the feedback, and we will get back to you with answers. So keep your questions coming in. If we can't cover it in this topic, then we'll cover you with an answer afterwards, and give you a feedback later on if we can as well. So even EU citizens relocating within the EU have to register. So anybody that's living in a country more than 3 months, whether it's just living or whether it's working or whether a student, has to register. And therefore these are the people that are becoming expats. They're living and working abroad in a country that's not their home country, and therein lies the complication. We get many questions about how many days can I spend back in the UK, and the basic answer is the same. If you're an expat and you want to be a tax resident in Spain or Portugal or Dubai or USA or Hong Kong or Singapore or Germany or Russia or Cyprus, if you're an expat, then generally 90 days travel back into the UK will be okay, because that's the international standard for travel visas. But whatever your home nationality is, if you spend more than 90 days back in that home country, then you will start getting problems with verifying your tax residency. Even so, that if you're a USA expat, or if you're a descendant or domiciled in America, you still could potentially have a tax return liability in the USA, even if you're a tax resident in that other country. These things don't necessarily go away. And this is not to do with Brexit and the EU, it's to do with international tax law, international residency and travel rights. So the expat is somebody that is living more than 3 months abroad, establishing a home, an abode, a residency, somewhere to live, somewhere to work in that overseas location. So it could be a retirement location, it could be just that they can work on the internet cross borders, and it doesn't matter whether they're sitting in a villa in the mountains, or like me, if I look the other side of the camera, I'm looking directly west over the Mediterranean. Lucky me. So you can work cross border and be an expat, but actually be doing that work in another place. We are in the digital age now, not in the future. We all use mobiles, we all use social media, we all use the internet for stuff, and that allows us the freedom to choose when we work and where we work, so that we don't have to be in a time and a place to do that work. And this is part of what expats is about. You could go and get a contract to work in an oil field in Saudi Arabia, or provide a service function in Dubai, but you could also be running your internet business from Costa Rica, from Belize, from Isle of Man, from Cyprus or Malta, and your tax residency would be in a different location. We then come into how you would organise that to protect yourself from tax. So the different jurisdictions have different tax potentials and liabilities, and this is the nub of the issue of how to organise yourself so that you pay the right amount of tax, the right amount of social insurance, that your residency is correct, that you've got your healthcare in place for your family, and that your business is protected and legitimate and is protected from a sales or income or corporation tax attack in the future. So providing that secure cross-border environment for your business is part of what we do at ProAct to protect expat business living, working abroad, to protect their families and their property and their residency rights on that, and also if something goes wrong, how that's going to impact with healthcare, relocation, and down the generations. All these things are impacted by Brexit, but only in that everything will be different, but it will be the same. It'll be the same but different. And Brexit is a distraction. On the Calais border between the EU and the UK, there's already customs checks. They check a standard 2%. They'll check a standard 2% after Brexit as well, once everything calms down. The politics, the noise might get in the way. It's just that big business has to do things slightly differently. There's different documentation that needs to be filled out when exporting outside the EU as opposed to importing, just so that the government can make sure that they can collect their customs and their taxes and their duties. Now that is different for a big company, and they have to organise that. But everything is online. Everything is available online to work cross-border, and it doesn't need masses of infrastructure set up in place to make these things work. There's a lot of noise in the Brexit debate about, Northern Southern Ireland being the only land border in the EU. It's not. It's not. There's a land border between Cyprus and Norway. Now, Norway is not in the EU. It's part of the EEA, the European Economic Area, which gives it a certain amount of common standards that Norway obeys, which are EU rules, but that Norway doesn't have a say in. But it's not part of the EU. And, the UK could have such an arrangement with the EU after Brexit. It might not be the same as Norway or Iceland or Liechtenstein or San Marino or Andorra or the Vatican City, all locations within the EU land borders. But people do still cross them, and they find a way to do that. But the EU can't agree with the UK what that arrangement will be in Ireland until after the UK leave Ireland. After the UK leave the EU, and that's the nub of the matter. So land borders already exist, and people drive from from Norway into Sweden or back to buy cheaper or more expensive stuff, depending upon the local customs and tariffs in the Norway and Sweden, how those differ. So there is a land border already, so there is a precedent for the UK, EU, Ireland arrangement, and we just need to wait and see how that's going to evolve. But meanwhile, expats living and working abroad beyond 3 months need to make the arrangements to protect themselves. The longer that you're living abroad, after 5 years, there becomes this, under international law, this permanent residency status. Now, the EU have that, so anybody, a UK expat living in Cyprus or Spain or Portugal for more than 5 years can get a permanent residency status, which gives them their residency rights and the free movement rights between the home country and the EU country up to all their life. It might need renewing after 5 or 10 years, but permanent residency means that they've got the right to remain. The UK version of that is called settled status, and EU expats can apply for that now, and as long as they can prove that they've lived and worked in the UK, then they can remain. Now, the settled status is based upon your national insurance number, and they're looking at your contributions as evidence that you've been in the UK, and they're looking at your address and where you live and where your correspondence is as proof of in the UK. And if there's some doubt and they're asking for extra information, but still, if you've been in the UK for 5 years and you can prove that you've lived there with your family or you've worked there for 5 years and paid national insurance, then settled status will be granted. Even if you haven't, even if you've only got 1 day from the 30th of December 2020, the EU expat can still get pre-settled status, and once they get through the 5 years, get the permanent residency. So same for a UK expat relocating now, before Brexit happens or before the end of the transition period, they can attain a permanent residency status, allowing them to protect their residency rights long term. So those are actions that expats can take now to protect their healthcare, their tax, their business, their family, their property in the EU. And then beyond that, we're into a process of naturalisation and citizenship. If you've got citizenship as an expat, you have the same rights as the local. What are the rights, citizens' rights of the French? Any EU citizens in the UK at the moment, for example, can't vote in the upcoming general election. If they are EU expats or if they've got settled status. If they then go on to apply for citizenship, then they can then vote in the general election as well. And in the UK, you can apply for citizenship after 5 years. So any EU expat who's been there and is entitled to settled status could actually then also get dual citizenship as well. Not all countries allow dual citizenship. Some countries in the EU don't allow dual citizenship, like, for example, Austria, Netherlands, Germany have got some issues. But apart from that, a lot of countries will allow dual citizenship after 5 years. So you could hold a French, a Cypriot and a British passport at the same time. And anybody with an EU passport, so if you've got a British passport and an Irish passport, you've still got the EU citizen rights when you travel under your Irish passport. So what are your family ties? What are your residency ties? Can you naturalise and get dual citizenship to protect your rights long term to be living and working abroad? So all these are issues that we cover as a business, and Brexit has effect on that just because we're looking at a different angle through a different window with a different set of rules. There's international treaties that cover the world of taxation, residency rights and travel, and expats know what they are now, and UK expats can protect themselves, and EU expats can protect themselves now by securing their residency rights, their healthcare and their business abroad. If you need to set up a business abroad or in the UK, you need your immigration rights sorted out, or you just want to talk to an advisor, contact us at proactpartnership.com or at our Living Working Abroad page here on Facebook, and we'll get back to you with some Proact know-how. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it interesting. We'll post a copy of this webinar on our webpage and on Facebook page later on, and we'd like to hear from you. Give us your questions so that next time we can maybe discuss your topic at the Proact Living Working Abroad webinar. Thanks very much.
The Proact Know-How, brought to you by Proact.